All right, here we are in section 4 of day 14, still talking about the goals of monetary policy. So we left off in the previous section talking about that the Fed could use different targets to achieve their goals. They could use a target of the money supply, or a target of stock prices, or a target of bank lending. But because it's more measurable and easier to control and more predictable, the Fed tends to use interest rates, specifically the federal funds interest rate, as their target. How exactly does the Fed choose a target federal funds interest rate, right? How does the Fed decide what it's going to set the federal funds interest rate at? So there is a theory about how the Fed should do this, and it's called the Taylor rule, okay? So let me show the Taylor rule to you. It looks kind of complex at first blush, but I don't think it actually is. Okay, what is the federal funds target interest rate? So the bar over this means that's the target that the Fed's going to set for the federal funds interest rate. The Taylor rule says there's a very simple formula for what that target should be. First, you figure out what the average real federal funds rate should be, right? What do we think that it should be on average? And then we add in expected inflation. And then we make some adjustment for how far above or below actual inflation is from our targeted rate of inflation. And then we make an adjustment for how far above or below actual output is from our targeted rate of output, right? So GY is our targeted rate of output. Pi bar is our targeted rate of inflation. So this is capturing how far are we from our targeted inflation and how far are we from our targeted output. Why do we have a half here? Well, that half is just basically the weight we put on those. And here in this formulation, we're assuming that the Fed weighs them both equally by half. Okay? Notice what this federal funds rate is saying. When inflation is above target, what should we be doing? We should be raising our federal funds interest rate target, right? So in other words, if inflation is going up, we raise our interest rate target. And notice here how much we have to raise it. If actual inflation rises by 1%, we have to increase the target by 1% here, and then also increase it by 0.5%. So if inflation goes up by 1%, we have to increase our federal funds rate target by 1.5%. And that makes sense, right? Because what we want to do is we really want to raise interest rates to try to drive down inflation, right? We're trying to raise interest rates a lot to drive down inflation, more than just 1%. What happens if output is greater than actual output? Well, then we once again want to raise interest rates because we're growing too fast. So if actual output is greater than our target, once again, we raise interest rates to slow the economy down. That's what this Taylor rule is saying, right? That's just what this Taylor rule is saying. Now, here's the interesting thing. If we pick some values for this, if we set the average federal funds rate target at 2%, and our inflation target at 2%, and our output target at 2%, and actually plot out what the Taylor rule says the Fed should be setting as their federal funds rate target, we get this red line. And the blue line then is the actual federal funds rate target, right? So the red line is the predicted target based on the Taylor rule, and the blue line is the actual federal funds rate target. And notice how close they are together, right? They're very, very close. This Taylor rule does a good job of explaining how the Fed behaves. However, there are a couple of interesting anomalies here that are worth thinking about. One is, notice here in the buildup before the 2008 crisis, right? Notice how the Fed kept interest rates much lower than what the Taylor rule said. Many critics say that this was the Fed keeping interest rates too low and that they fueled the bubble. And there's something to that. Also notice here what happened after 2008. After 2008, the Taylor rule said the Fed should have raised interest rates a lot more, but instead the Fed kept interest rates quite low. So you know, um, I don't know exactly how to interpret that, other than the Taylor rule really thought the Fed should have been more aggressive in raising interest rates as the economy recovered after 2008. So the Taylor rule in general is a good way to kind of estimate what the Fed should keep their federal funds rate target at. The Fed is very well aware of the Taylor rule, and they actually do rely upon this, not exclusively, but they do rely upon this when they think about what they're going to set their federal funds rate target. And more importantly, people in markets watch these, right? People who are Fed watchers, right? People who basically watch the Fed, trying to predict what the Fed is going to do, to try to make predictions about how that will impact the market. They pay very close attention to the Taylor rule. So, for those of you who are going to be involved in working in the financial industry, being familiar with the Taylor rule is really important, because oftentimes markets will use this as a kind of guide to what they think the Fed is going to do here in the future. We've talked about this before, but let's talk about this again. Should the Fed respond to asset bubbles? Right? One of the goals of monetary policy has not been to keep the stock market from booming and busting, but should it be? Should the Fed be involved in trying to pop a stock market bubble before it completely blows up, right? So before the bubble gets really big, try to take some air out of it, so that if it does pop, it's not going to be such a big blow up. Many economists have argued, yes, that the Fed should spend a lot of time thinking about asset bubbles and stock market bubbles, and actually think about them much more than they have in the past. And the argument for the Fed thinking about these is that bubbles are driven by debt finance speculation, right? And so the Fed could limit this by making sure that it raises interest rates when they see bubbles occurring. And also by being more strict in regulation. And in fact, people who believe the Fed should take a bigger role with bubbles really believe in much more about the regulation part of this, right? That the Fed should really be clamping down on lending and borrowing when they see bubbles taking off, right? And so people who believe the Fed should have a goal of managing asset prices really just say, how can a central bank just sit around and watch this stuff happen? How can we watch a stock market get way overvalued and then collapse, right? Surely the central bank can do something. Having said that, probably more economists believe that this just doesn't work very well in practice. And including this, it means really two past Fed chairs of Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan were very big critics of the Fed getting too involved in trying to manage asset prices. One is because monetary policy is too broad and powerful, right? When the Fed changes interest rates, they're not just impacting stock markets, they're impacting every aspect of the economy. And so, in the words of Ben Bernanke, trying to pop an asset bubble with monetary policy is like popping a soap bubble with a sledgehammer. It's just too big, right? And who knows what you're going to break in the process. It's just, monetary policy isn't like a fine scalpel. It is more like a sledgehammer. Also, there's this question of, are policymakers really smarter than the market, right? If there are people at the Fed who can predict bubbles, the Fed can't afford them, right? So the Fed often doesn't know when a bubble is occurring, right? Or they don't know exactly when it's occurring. Sometimes in hindsight it looks right, but in real time, sometimes it's hard to say. And then which assets? Should the Fed also be involved in housing prices or art market bubbles, or any other kind of asset bubble, right? It's really, really hard to say, right? Which assets are most important. You can make an argument that housing is at least as important as the stock market. Does that mean that the Fed should be paying attention to when housing prices are going up? And if they feel housing prices in New York are going up too fast, they should be changing monetary policy, right? So, it sounds reasonable for central banks to be involved in managing asset prices and trying to prevent bubbles. But in practice, it's just very hard, right? It's just very hard. And so in practice, the Fed has tried to stay away from doing this. The Fed does think more broadly about financial market stability, but they've been very reluctant to try to get too heavily involved in trying to manage specific markets. Okay, one last topic here before I let you go. The Fed has many goals that they're trying to achieve. Some economists have argued that the Fed should stop trying to do multiple things at one time, and that they should just focus on a single objective, a rule. So instead of trying to manage output and inflation and exchange rates and financial market stability and employment, why doesn't the Fed just pick one thing to focus on and do that well? And that is an inflation target, right? An inflation target would be to have only a single objective that is perfectly clear, right? So the European Central Bank, the ECB, has as its only goal to maintain inflation of 2%. And the proponents of this say there's reasons why this works. First, it's easily understood by the public. Everybody can understand what the central bank is doing here, right? If you go out on the street here in, well, wherever you are, and you ask people what are the goals that the Federal Reserve is trying to achieve, most people are not going to have a very clear idea about that. But for the European Central Bank, it's a lot easier, right? They're just maintaining inflation of 2%. So it's easily understood. It's also credible because you're really going to evaluate the central bank on the one thing that they can control, right? Inflation. And so the idea is that because this policy is credible, it also helps keep expected inflation low, and it actually helps you achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is low inflation. One of the arguments for this at a deeper level is this idea of time inconsistency. So time inconsistency is a common problem, right? A common problem in policy. So what time inconsistency means is that many times it's impossible to follow the optimal policy in the long run because you have incentives not to follow it in the short run. Okay, let me say that again. The optimal policy in the long run is hard to follow because in the short run, you have incentives not to follow it. So let me give you a couple of examples of this outside of economics, right? One example is hostages, right? The US has a policy of never negotiating for hostages. Why is this the US government's policy? Well, because in the long run, this is the right policy, right? You don't want to give terrorists any incentive to take hostages. So you make a long run policy that the US government can't negotiate for hostages. However, what we've seen is that that is a very difficult policy for the US government to follow in the short run. Because in the short run, when a hostage is taken, there's a lot of incentive to try to, do what you can to get that person back, right? And so there's been many examples in US history. Like in the 1980s, there was a big scandal in the US called the Iran-Contra hostage scandal, where basically the US government was giving arms to Iran through the back door to help bring back American hostages, right? That was clearly illegal, but also understandable why the US was trying to do this, right? It's hard to follow the optimal policy in the long run when there's big incentives not to do it in the short run. I'll give you another example. Some of you might remember this example because I often use it in intro macro. But it's an example of when, as a family, my mom and dad and me and my two younger sisters drove from Ohio, where I grew up, down to Florida to go to Disney World. And so I was about 10 and my younger sisters were 8 and 4. And we decided that, or my mom and dad, we rarely went on vacation, but my mom and dad said, we're going to go to Florida. And so my mom packed up the car, including about 2 weeks of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And we all piled into the car and we drive out my driveway, take a right on the road, and if I looked out the back window, I could probably still see my house back there. And already me and my sisters are just fighting like crazy, right? And this is back in the old days when we didn't have to wear seat belts and we had these big ass cars. And so it was just like a, world wrestling back in the back seat. And so we are fighting and screaming and slapping each other. Don't touch me, blah, blah, blah. And my mom, who is driving, just pulls the car over to the side of the road. And she says, if you kids don't shut up, we're going to turn around and not go to Disney World. Okay. Now, was that believable? Absolutely not, right? There is no way that we believe that my mom and dad were going to turn around and go back home, right? Because, well, first off, we had 2 weeks of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in the car that I knew my mom was too cheap to let go to waste. And I knew my dad had taken time off of work. We knew we were going to Disney World, right? The optimal policy in the long run, which is to punish us to get us to behave, was not optimal in the short run. And so as soon as my mom got back on the road, what did we do? We just started fighting again. And we fought all the way down to Florida. And it was awesome because I was bigger than my sisters. That's the problem, right? That is the problem oftentimes with policy. The things that are best in the long run are hard to do in the short run. And the same happens with monetary policy. What's the best in the long run? Low inflation. But in the short run, there's big incentives to try to inflate, right? And try to stimulate the economy, even though it has costs in the long run. So how do you get past this time inconsistency problem? Well, there's really a couple of ways. One is that the policymakers could establish some credibility or develop a reputation, right? If my mom would have turned the car around and we would have gone home and not gone to Disney World, I probably would be a better person today because she would have established some credibility with me and my sisters. And this is a mistake I do not make with my kids. I punish them every day, whether they need it or not, right? Because I understand time inconsistency and reputation. The other way that you can deal with this is just simply tie the hands of policymakers, make it a binding rule, like an inflation rule. Say, we're not going to evaluate you on any of these other things. You just keep inflation low. And if you don't do that, then we're going to know it, right? And you will be held accountable. And so, the argument here is that you'll get much better outcomes if you let the central bank focus on one thing. Many central banks have moved to inflation targets. The European Central Bank has one. Here's 3 examples of central banks that have moved to an inflation target. And the 3 central banks are New Zealand and Canada and the UK, right? So the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, and the Bank of New Zealand have all moved to inflation targets. And this green line here in each case says when the governments move to inflation targets. And notice how in each of these cases, moving to an inflation target not only reduced inflation, but it actually reduced the volatility of inflation. And so this would make, would have a lot of benefits, not just in terms of the macro economy, but in terms of the financial development, right? Because as we've talked about, there's no better way of ruining a financial system than having high and volatile inflation. So, you see here, New Zealand, inflation's all over the place. Or Canada, a lot of fluctuation. UK, a lot of fluctuation. Now they don't have it. And so, many critics have said, listen, why are we asking too much of our central banks? Why are we asking our central banks to do all of these things? Why don't we just ask them to do one thing and to do it very well? And that this would be a very valuable thing if we could count on having low and variable inflation. Of course, what's the argument against having an inflation rule? And the argument against having an inflation rule is what's happening just this moment. What happens when there's a crisis, right? An inflation rule is just too rigid. It doesn't give policymakers enough flexibility to respond to the emergencies. During 2008, the Fed was able to respond a lot more to that crisis than the European Central Bank was. And the same is happening right now. The Fed is doing all sorts of interesting things related to trying to respond to this pandemic. The European Central Bank has very little leeway to respond very much. They don't have the leeway to cut interest rates down to zero, or to do any big bond buyback programs, or any of the other things that the Fed has been thinking about doing. Right? So, this is the problem. When you get in a time period like we're in today, you begin to see that having a rules-based policy is somewhat problematic, because it just doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility to respond to the unforeseeable, right? So the Fed Reserve has a stated policy that it would like to keep inflation at 2% a year, but it is not a rule, right? There's nothing that binds the Fed to that. So while the Fed has publicly stated that that's what they would like to achieve, they're not bound to it in the same way the European Central Bank is. And maybe that works for the Fed, because the Fed has established some credibility, and it has done a basically good job. But what about the future, right? What happens if in the future idiots get appointed to the Federal Reserve? Is that still going to be true? Does a rule begin to become more valuable when you don't have reasonable people in charge of monetary policy? And the answer is probably. So, there's no clear answer here, right? There's certainly some big advantages to rules, but there's also some big advantages to flexibility. And so while the US has established a reputation for maintaining low inflation, reputation can be lost, right? It only takes a few things, a few idiots to wreck the party for everybody. And so, that's the worry about the leeway that the Fed is given here, is that it has given the Fed a lot of leeway to do good things, but it could also give the Fed leeway to do bad things. So there's no clear answer to this about whether the US would benefit to moving to an inflation target or not. But I think it's interesting to think about when we think about the overall goals of monetary policy. Okay, well, that really is the end of our discussion about not just the goals of monetary policy, but really our end of our discussion about central banking and monetary policy. So tomorrow, day 15, we're moving on to the last part of this course, where we're going to talk about international financial systems, right? So we're going to talk about finance from more of an international perspective than we have to this point. So goodbye to central banking, hello to international finance. All right, have a good afternoon, or good day, or whenever the hell you're watching this. See you tomorrow.